Hey, welcome back. I'm Ibnul J. Farabi, and this is Underworld Kings, The Rise and Fall. You know, living in New York, you get used to the rhythm of the city, the constant hum of life. But sometimes, I find myself thinking about a different kind of rhythm entirely. The slow, muddy flow of a great river, the oppressive heat of a Mississippi summer, and the silence of a community holding its breath, waiting for a terror to pass. That's where our story lives today, not in a bustling metropolis, but in the port city of Vicksburg in the year 1871. A place and a time grappling with the aftermath of the Civil War, with Reconstruction, with profound change. And into that fragile moment stepped a shadow, a man who would become known as the Demon of the Delta, and who many historians now consider the American South's first documented serial killer. His name was Samuel Little. No, not the Samuel Little who confessed to 93 murders in the 20th century. This was a different monster, a white man who preyed upon the most vulnerable in Vicksburg's fractured society, freed black women. For months, the city was gripped by a series of brutal, mysterious killings. The victims were found in secluded areas, often near the river or in ravines, strangled or beaten to death. The violence was intimate, personal, and the response from the authorities was, at best, indifferent. The newspapers of the time barely noted the deaths of these poor women, often reducing them to a single line, if they mentioned them at all. In a society still reeling from war, their lives were not considered headline news. Their disappearances were not urgent cases. This, of course, created the perfect hunting ground for a predator. The terror truly crystallized around two specific murders in the spring of 1871. The bodies of two young black women, Mary and Ellen, were discovered in a wooded gully. They had been strangled. The similarity was unmistakable, a signature of violence that finally pierced the public consciousness. Panic began to spread through the black community in Vicksburg. Whispers of a demon, a phantom, a man who moved through the night unseen. The police, under pressure, had few leads and seemingly little motivation to find more. It was a perfect storm of vulnerability, societal neglect, and evil. And into that storm, finally, stepped a figure who refused to let these women be forgotten. A black undertaker named William H. Foote. Foote was a respected businessman, a pillar of his community. He prepared the bodies of the victims for burial. He saw the bruises, the ligature marks, the horror etched on their faces. He listened to the grieving families when the law would not. And he made a decision. He would become an investigator. Using his own money and his deep connections within the community, Foote began his own inquiry. He tracked movements. He gathered whispers. He pieced together a pattern where the official police saw only isolated incidents. His work revealed a suspect, a seemingly unremarkable man named Samuel Little, a former Confederate soldier who drifted around Vicksburg, known to be violent and to frequent the same areas where the women were last seen. Foote took his findings to the police and was, essentially, ignored. So, William Foote did something extraordinary. He went to the press, not the mainstream papers, but to a Republican newspaper sympathetic to the Reconstruction cause, called the Vicksburg Herald. He laid out his evidence. He named Samuel Little, and he shamed the inaction of the city. This publication forced the hand of the sheriff. Samuel Little was finally arrested. But this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a legal and social drama that would expose the raw nerves of the era. Because securing an arrest was one thing. Securing a conviction for the murders of black women in 1870s Mississippi was an entirely different battle. The trial was a spectacle. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the meticulous, almost obsessive work of William Foote. He presented physical evidence he had preserved himself, testimony he had gathered. He was, in every sense, the lead detective. Samuel Little, meanwhile, maintained a cool, almost arrogant demeanor. The defense strategy was stark. They didn't just argue innocence. They argued that the lives lost were of no consequence. They painted the victims as women of low morals, implying their deaths were not a great loss to society. It was a brutal, calculated play on the prejudices of the all-white jury. But Foote's evidence was powerful. The connections were clear. And perhaps, just perhaps, there was a sliver of new order brought by Reconstruction that allowed for a different outcome. Against all odds, Samuel Little was found guilty of murder and sentenced to hang. The story should end there, right? Justice served. But the demon of the Delta had one more card to play. While awaiting execution in his cell, Samuel Little confessed. But not to remorse. He confessed to more murders. He calmly detailed the killings of up to a dozen other women, black and white, in Mississippi and Louisiana, describing where he hid their bodies. He gave locations, descriptions. It was a chilling, boastful monologue, a final act of control. And when authorities checked the places he described, they found skeletal remains. He was telling the truth. This confession, this grotesque inventory, is what solidifies his historical status as a serial killer. He wasn't a crime of passion. He was a predator with a pattern, a method, and a type. On the gallows in October 1871, his last reported words were a dry, unrepentant statement about the weather. And then, the demon of the Delta was gone. Reflecting on this story from my desk here in New York, what stays with me isn't the killer's brutality, though that's horrifying. It's the figure of William Foote, an engineer, like me, but of justice in a system designed to fail. He saw a problem, a pattern of violence the official system refused to acknowledge, and he applied a systematic, diligent solution. He used his resources, his intellect, and his profound empathy to build a case where there was none. In many ways, he was the first true criminal profiler in American history, working decades before the term was invented, driven not by fame, but by a basic sense of decency. He is the underworld king who rose in this story, not a king of crime, but a king of relentless, moral pursuit. The tragedy of the Vicksburg murders is a story of a monster who emerged from the chaos of a shattered society. But it's also a story about whose lives are valued and whose deaths are deemed worth investigating. It's a story that, sadly, echoes forward through time. And it's a story that would have been completely lost to history if not for the courage of one man who refused to look away. Samuel Little was the South's first serial killer, but William Foote was its first and most necessary avenger. Thank you for listening to this episode of Underworld Kings. If these deep dives into forgotten histories matter to you, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. Sharing an episode with a friend is the best way to support us. This is Ibnul J. Farabi, reminding you that every story, no matter how dark, has something to teach us. Until next time, stay curious. This podcast is a production of Light Knot Studios. Visit us at https://www.lightknotstudios.com.